Good morning, children. Earlier we had done the various parts of the skeleton system. Today we are going to start with the joints, and the point where two separate bones they are joined to each other, that is called joint. And the joints are of three major types, that is immovable, partially movable and freely movable. Immovable joint, in this type of joint, no movement is possible between the two bones. And the structures between the bones, it should be sutures, not structures, sutures. These lines which are shown between the bones of the skull are example of immovable joint. These lines, the sutures, they show the different bones which are joined to each other. Then partially movable joints. Here only little movement occurs between two bones. For example, the joint between the rib and the breastbone and between the vertebra. Then freely movable joints are there, and in this type, varying degree of movements are possible between the two bones forming the joint. And the four major types of movable joints are: number one, gliding joint, pivot joint, the hinge joint, and ball and socket joint. The gliding joint, it occurs between the bones of the wrist and also between the bones of the ankle as well as between the vertebra. You all must have seen that your hand, it can rotate all around on your wrist. So this type of joint is present between the bones of the wrist, bones of the ankle, and even between the vertebrae. And pivot joint, here one bone is rotated over a pivot-like end of another bone. So one bone acts like a pivot and the other bone rotates over it. For example, the skull is rotated on the upper end of axis vertebra. And third is hinge joint. This joint moves like a hinge in one plane only, just like the hinge of the door, as you can open the door only in one direction, not the other. In the same way, the elbow joint between the humerus and the ulna, and joints between the bones of your finger and toes, and the less perfectly the knee joint, the hinge joints usually give sufficient power. So the hinge joint is found in your arm, where the elbow joint is there. In the elbow joint, the humerus and the ulna, they are movable. You can just move them in one direction but not the other, just like the door will open only in one way, not the other way. Then ball and socket joint. Here one end of the bone is rounded and ball-like and fits in the cup-like depression of the other bone. So there is a cup-like depression of one bone, and the ball-like bone or other bone just rotates in it. And this fits into the cup-like depression of another bone, and this joint provides movement in any direction. And two best examples are the shoulder joint and the hip joint. And in shoulder joint, the head of the humerus fits into the socket of the glenoid cavity of shoulder girdle, and the hip joint, the large ball-like head of the femur, fits into the deep socket acetabulum of the hip girdle. So these are the four types of freely movable joints. Next is the synovial joints. The freely movable joints stated above, like the shoulder joint, the knee joint, are also called the synovial joints. They allow considerable degree of movement, and these joints have two special requirements. Firstly, they should be held firmly in position. So the two bones should be firmly held together in position, and secondly, the surfaces coming in contact should be well lubricated to remove friction, because these two bones, they move freely, so there is going to be friction. So to avoid friction, they should be well lubricated, and the lubricating fluid wherever it occurs is called synovial fluid, and hence the synovial joint. The knee joint is synovial joint because two big bones, they are joined here, and in between them is the synovial fluid which lubricates this joint and avoids friction. And the knee joint, for example, is a synovial joint. It is held in position by strong ligaments. So these strong ligaments hold the knee joint in position, as well as protected by the other outer fibrous capsule, and it is even protected by outer fibrous capsule, and the ligaments prevent dislocation in normal movement. Synovial fluid is contained in the sac formed of very thin synovial membrane, and this sac serves as a cushion between the bones. So this is the knee joint, and this diagram is very important. You should do it, and even this one. Sometimes they can give you this diagram and they may ask you to label it, and they may ask you functions of the various parts. Next we come over to muscles. The muscles in the body provide means of all movements. They cover the skeletal framework and also give color to the counter to the body, that is shape to the body. So provides movement, then gives the shape to the body. Muscles help to maintain body posture while sitting, standing or walking. Most muscles are long bundles of contractile tissue. Each muscle usually has two ends, a fixed end where the muscle originates and a movable end which pulls some other part. So the muscle is fixed at one end and movable at the other end, and that end is pulled by the muscle. And this movable end is drawn out to form a tough structure, the tendon, which is attached to the bones. When stimulated by the nerve, and muscle contracts to become shorter and thicker, and thus pulls the bone at the movable end. See here, these muscles are there. They are fixed at one end and movable at the other. When they contract, they pull the bone towards the body, and the muscles can only contract and relax. They can either contract or relax. They can't lengthen. Their size won't increase. And this is how these muscles work. And there are antagonistic muscles. A structure which has been moved by a muscle cannot return to its original position without the action of another muscle. Like this muscle contracted, the lower arm is pulled over the upper arm. But it can't move back unless the other muscle performs the action. And such muscles causing opposing movement are called antagonistic muscles. If this one contracts, this relaxes, then only the movement is possible. Otherwise, not. And when this contracts, this one relaxes. So, such pair of muscles is called antagonistic pair of muscles. Example, the bicep muscles of upper arm flexes, that is bends the lower arm over the upper arm. Straightening of the lower arm is brought about by the tricep, that is extensor muscle. Therefore, these two muscles are antagonistic. This much for today.